While we're waiting for, I think, a few more folks to come join us, I just like to check in where everybody is sitting with last week's class. And just a reminder, last week we turned the corner in our class, in our curriculum. The curriculum is divided into 3 sections, and it's all about Jewish peoplehood, but the first section was the first section was really talking about all of these different aspects of conceptions of Jewish peoplehood. And we talked about the Judaism of being and the Judaism of becoming, and going from no homes to 2 homes, different ways of thinking about Jewish peoplehood. Then we looked, for the next several weeks, we looked at the challenges to Jewish peoplehood, and we looked at a whole bunch: anti-Semitism, like changing ideas of what people think, what Jews think is good for the Jews, identity politics, and then last week we turned the corner to sort of the last 3 sessions. Last week, this week, and next week are sort of Hartman's sort of closing argument. This curriculum sort of closing argument for how we can retell a new story about Jewish peoplehood that works to have an expansive approach to how we tell the story of the Jewish people. And so last week we looked at the difference between thinking about Jewish identity as a family and looking at Jewish identity as a consumer. And we talked about the push and pull of those 2 ideas in the contemporary Jewish life. And the claim was that the family model was the predominant model for Jewish collective consciousness, for how we think about ourselves as Jews. We thought about ourselves as the Jewish family, the ganze Mishpacha, right? The large Jewish family, since the inception of Judaism, right? That is to say, we've always thought of ourselves in some way, the Jewish people, as an extended family. And the Torah itself opens itself up to that, because the first whole book of the Torah is just dealing with the family of the Jewish people, right? Jacob and his sons, and the Joseph narrative, and all of this sort of stuff it's the people as a family. And even once you get into this idea of, okay, now each of those children of Jacob are actually tribes, even so, you sort of think about them as all being part of the same family. We call our people B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel. We're all part of the same family, right? So that's sort of baked in. But since in the 21st century, in the late 20th century, and in the 21st century, that model, the model of family, is challenged by and competes with models of multiple identities, right? I'm a Red Sox fan. I'm an American. I'm a Schenectadean, and the idea of consumerism, meaning like I want Judaism and my Jewish identity to be meaningful to me, and if it's not meaningful to me at this synagogue, well, I can go to the next synagogue, and so since I'm treating Jewish communal life like a consumer, then that actually, Hartman pointed out that impels us to greater creativity, but it also in some ways cheapens the bonds and ties that we think of in terms of our community, right? It weakens those ties, but it might actually have good positive aspects too, which is that it forces us to be creative, and it forces us to think of ourselves as trying to meet people's most meaningful need. It's not, right? It's not enough to just, you can't just be a part of Judaism just because. I think that has to be meaningful to you. So the primary values of the family model are loyalty and protection. And the primary values of the consumer model are meaning and benefits. And so when Israelis say, I don't need to know you or anything about you or how you live, you're Jewish and I'm Jewish, and therefore I'm loyal to you. And if they're going to come for you, the Israeli army is going to protect you, right? That is responding to that family model of loyalty and protection, and they think they're being a really good sibling by doing that. And when we, the American Jewish community, the North American Jewish community, turns to the state of Israel and say, your actions with regard to the Palestinians, with regard to pluralism and access to different forms of Judaism within Israel, your actions are depriving our people of a sense of meaning in our relationship. Like, how can we be engaged in relationship with you when you're doing these things that we think are completely unmeaningful, in fact the opposite of meaningful, right? Like counter to our values, right? Then we say, like, come on, you've got to be better at appealing to our values, right? We're saying you're not being a good sibling, but we're responding to it in these completely different ways. We're talking past each other sort of in some way as communities, like because of this difference between the predominance of the family model versus the predominance of the consumerist model. And I have to say, in our conversation last week, the thing that came up most often was, wouldn't it be nice if Israeli Jews were interested in what our Judaism looked like? Wouldn't it be nice if there were birthright trips that brought Israeli Jews to America to see what American Judaism was like? Wouldn't it be nice if our Israeli family members actually showed an interest in our forms of Judaism? And thinking about these two models of the family model and the consumerist model gives us one avenue for like contextualizing that feeling of lack of connection. And on the Israeli side, right, when they look at us and we as an American Jewish community, right, vote 75-80% for Joe Biden instead of Donald Trump, when we consistently as an American Jewish community, like preference local politics over a perception of what would be good for Israel, okay, they feel completely betrayed by siblings who they feel like are stabbing them in the back. Like, they feel like, we've got your back, we're loyal to you, why aren't you loyal to us? And it's a complete it's completely talking past each other. Israel demands loyalty and solidarity from North American Jews, regardless of Israel's policies, because families stand together no matter what. Like, so your uncle, good night, Ellie. After my class, sure. Good night. Good night. So your uncle has a problem with an alcohol addiction. You're still gonna love him because he's your uncle, right? That's sort of, yeah, Israel's got some issues, but you still gotta love him, still gotta love her, right? family, whereas North American Jews demand that Israel earn its engagement by reflecting its interests and sensibilities, by basically conforming to our consumerist model of Jewish identity. The closing argument of the lecture was that you need both of these models, that you need the thick connections that come from thinking about yourself as a family with striving for meaning that comes from thinking of yourself as a consumer. And I think the way that he said it was the synergy between the family and the consumer models can salvage the Israel versus world Jewry relationship by recognizing that we cannot take our adult family for granted when family members have multiple loyalties and commitments. In other words, it was all very nice and good to think of ourselves as a family when we were all young children in our parents' house. But now that we're all grown siblings with our own families and our own multiple identities and our own ways of being in the world, we still have to figure out how to act like siblings as adults that's the metaphor. So, and thinking about this as a synergy. So that's a little review of last week's class. And now that I've given you last week's class in a 12-minute summary, if anybody has any comments or reflections, or if there was anything from last week's class that stuck with you, I'd love to hear.
I think you covered a lot of what we talked about. And when you put it in the context of sibling stuff, it's interesting for me as an only child. I don't quite catch it all, but I get it, sort of. And sometimes I'm glad, I guess, that I don't have to worry about that. But I do hear the big issue between the way we regard Israelis and the way Israelis regard us. And clearly, if we don't support everything, there are some people, if we don't support Israel with a blanket support, then we're considered not good siblings. Whereas some of us will support this and that rather than the whole of it.
Yeah, Murray. You have to unmute. Murray, you're still muted.
I'm somewhat not accepting the analogy of Trump and Biden example that the Israelis will turn around and say your loyalty to Biden is stabbing us in the back because Trump has done so much for us, etc., etc. I think because there is between the two two members of the family, there's a big, not a wall, but a big influence that governs one sibling in America. We may support Biden and be for Biden and against Trump because we are Americans, we are Jews supporting Israel primarily. Primarily, we are Americans. And I think there have to be recognized certain differences, certain distinctions, but we can still, whether it is husband and wife, or brother and sister, etc., they can have different beliefs and different influences. One may be working on one project, one on another project, and still be friendly and supporting each other in other respects. We cannot expect that American Jews would be completely, let's say, subservient to the Israeli needs.
Yeah, I completely, I think you're exactly right. That is to say, we American Jews are operating under a different set of assumptions about how we should vote in our own country's elections than our siblings in Israel are operating under a set of assumptions about how we should vote. And I would also, I would also argue like that a lot of American Jews think that Trump's policies toward Israel, even though they were very well received in Israel by Israeli Jews, were reckless and endanger Israel's standing long term in the world. And like pointing to, that's not the only relationship that Israel has with an authoritarian regime that works sort of geopolitically for Israel, but doesn't work morally for the values of most American Jews. I think it would not be hard for an American Jew to say, I show my loyalty to Israel by voting for Biden over Trump. My only point in bringing that particular example up is that most Israeli Jews thought that Trump was the best the best American president for Israel in decades, and did sort of feel like the American Jewish community deserved to show Trump loyalty for that reason. And like that was a very common opinion on the street in Israel. So, and I think it does sort of speak to this aspect of responding to different values, right? Loyalty versus meaning, protection, right? Versus versus sort of consumer, like finding the values, the identity values. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, I think the Israelis might even go a step farther than that and say you're wrong to distinguish between Israeli Jewish values and American Jewish values. There are only Jewish values, and you're disregarding them in pursuit of something that may be American but is not Jewish. I'm not trying to endorse that view, but it's easy for me to imagine Israelis making it.
Yes, I mean, I definitely think you could go that way. I also think that you could say, like, as an American Jew, like, supporting a candidate who supports xenophobia and allows for racism and anti-Semitism to be like part of the common parlance of the political movement that they're a part of, like, is counter to Jewish values, not just counter to American values, but counter to Jewish values. And so you could make an argument like that in response, like, no, it's Jewish to not do this. Yeah, Bob.
It seems like there's such heterogeneity in Israel in terms of different political parties making
No
up their
question.
parliamentary system. So it's really hard to pin down what are Jewish values in Israel. If I talk to our Haredi friends, they'll tell us about their values. And they are secular people in Tel Aviv will tell us about their values. It's a tiny country and it's got huge diversity. So who are they coming off telling us that we need to have Jewish values? You know, it just doesn't make sense somehow.
No question. No question. No question. So at the beginning of last week's lecture, the Hartman suggested that there are 5 sort of lenses that he wants to look at with respect to categories that shape our current narratives of Jewish peoplehood and how we can think about them. And they are family, shared believers, partners, investors, and consumers. And in last week's class, we looked at the first one and the fifth one, that is family versus consumers. In today's lecture, we're going to look at the other three: shared believers, partners, and investors. But before we completely jump right into that, like, you have to think about, right? A shared believer is one type of thinking about how we relate to each other. Like a partner, right? Using a business model, right? Partners invest together, they go in together, and they both share in both the success and the failure, right? Investors are more protected, I think, from the failures than partners, right? But they also share in successes and failures, but I think to a less extent. They're less involved, right? So, okay, clearly these three, Hartman imagines these three as also being deeply connected in sort of the way that the family versus consumer model was connected. So we're going to listen to the lecture, and we're going to jump in sort of to understand. You can follow along also with the sources that the lecture is going to cite in the source book on page 279, and we'll also discuss some of those sources. I did mention it at the top of the class, but then some people walked in. Today is Yom Ha'atzmaut, so Chag Sameach, and we can dedicate our learning today to Israel's 74th year of independence, which is, I think, a miracle in many ways. All right, let me share my screen. Optimize for video clip.
In this session, we will explore the other three models within our matrix, which shape and define the nature of Jewish peoplehood and the relationship between Israel and world Jewry. These models are shared believers, partners, and investors. What does each require? What does each assume? Are they helpful foundations for our Jewish collective life? Are they still relevant today? Or more importantly, what do we need to do to revitalize them as constructive forces? I will then explore these issues in greater depth in an interview with my colleagues, political and social activist Tehila Friedman and Rabbi Seth Kirshner. As stated, today we will explore the categories of shared believers, partners, and investors. Let's begin with restating our definitions. Fellow believers are a group of people who join together by virtue of a shared belief or commitment to embody or promulgate a value, principle, or cause. To be part of the Jewish people is to be part of a group with a common mission. For example, the commandment to be holy, tikkun olam, the commandment to be a light unto the nations, to being God's witness, to not give Hitler a posthumous victory. One joins because of one's identification with the mission. One can exit if one so chooses. The primary motivation for such an exit may be when one believes that the mission is no longer shared or no longer relevant or compelling. Partners are groups of individuals who join in a common undertaking with a shared purpose. It can be to further a certain belief, but it can also be for less idealistic reasons, such as one's safety or self-interest. What is important about this specific category in the context of the relationship between Israel and world Jewry is that partners share both the risks and the profits. While exit is possible, one cannot exit at will. If there are losses or liabilities, one remains responsible. To be a partner is to be a partner together in good times and bad. One exits the partnership principally when the aim of the partnership is no longer shared, or when it has been achieved, or when one of the partners is perceived to be acting in bad faith. Investors do not share in the mutual obligations of partners. They invest with the aim of gaining or facilitating a particular end or outcome. What is particular about this category, and the reason it is important in the context of Israel and world Jewry, is that it involves the expenditure of money, capital, or resources. And such expenditures are always complicated. An essential aspect of the investor relationship is that it embodies a core asymmetry between the one with the capital and the investee, and the inherited power and need imbalance which it implies. The investor exits with relative ease once the outcome has been achieved, when there are unacceptable losses, or when the investor believes that achieving the particular outcome is no longer feasible or shared by the investee. Our first category looks at the Jewish people as a community of fellow believers. While Jews were first and foremost family, we were also a community built around shared belief. In the word of the Ten Commandments, I, the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, you shall have no other gods besides me. We went down to Egypt as a family and were redeemed because we were a family. Once redeemed, however, Judaism opened up a new chapter, what I referred to in the beginning of this series as the covenant of becoming, as introduced first in the book of Exodus. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Over the millennia, the shared beliefs of Jewish life varied and changed. Belief in some notion of God, loyalty to the Jewish people, commitment to the essential practices of the law were more or less constant and generally accepted as our foundational shared beliefs. With emancipation and enlightenment, however, Judaism, more than uniting us, began to divide us. Shared beliefs became the foundation of denominations and sub-communities, which competed for the loyalty and identity of Jews, and often undermined a singular Jewish collective identity. After the Holocaust, and with the establishment of the State of Israel, however, the majority of Jews worldwide found a new set of beliefs around which the Jewish people could unite. It was a shared belief around the significance of Israel. This shared belief served as the cornerstone of the relationship between Israel and world Jewry. It involved two core principles. The first was that the safety of Jews required the existence of an independent, sovereign homeland for the Jewish people, a place of refuge for Jews if and when their lives were threatened, a place with a Jewish army prepared and capable of defending the Jewish people. Through Israel's existence, never again was not an aspiration, but a policy. The second shared belief was that the homeland of the Jewish people would give expression to the best of what Judaism and the Jewish people stood for. A state where Jews were responsible for shaping all aspects of life in the public sphere, which would serve as the stage in which Jewish values and principles would be amplified and become a light unto the world. These two beliefs, as you saw in the source book, paralleled the two essential features of Zionism, if you will, a Zionism of being and a Zionism of becoming. What is interesting and particularly challenging is that by the end of the 20th century and now the beginning of the 21st century, both of these beliefs no longer serve to coalesce the Jewish community in North America around support for or even a relationship with Israel. For North American Jews, despite the recent increases in anti-Semitism, America and Canada are not merely perceived as homes, but by and large welcoming and safe homes. Without belittling the concern about the rise of anti-Semitism, most North Americans still worry more when their children visit Israel than when they walk the streets of Toronto, New York, or Chicago. With the exception of European Jewry, it is in Israel that the highest number of Jews experience the most risk, be it from terror, Hamas or Hezbollah missiles, or potentially nuclear Iran. The idea of Israel and Jewish sovereignty as necessary for Jewish safety, so central to Zionism and the relationship to Israel pre- and post-Holocaust, has slowly eroded. as Jews experience continued at-homeness in North America. Paradoxically, one of the most powerful expressions of this can be found in what is commonly perceived as the most pro-Israel North American institution, Aipac. Aipac does not serve merely as a pro-Israel lobby, but represents an alternate theory for how best to ensure Jewish survival in the 21st century. True, Israel and the IDF are crucial, but for the pro-Israel community, a no less significant source of power is located in Washington, thereby elevating North American Jewish life and its influence on Capitol Hill to the status of being equally important for Jewish physical safety. Aipac, Jewish federations, the Joint, the American Jewish Community, the Israeli-American Council are all expressions not merely of Jewish homeness, but of Jewish power and influence, which life outside of Israel uniquely provides. However, it is around the second aspect of the shared belief in Israel's significance that we are witnessing the greatest transformation. The growing debate, discomfort, criticism, and alienation regarding Israel's policies on occupation, state and religion, religious pluralism, democracy, and minority rights have eroded for many the idea that Israel represents the best of Judaism and Jewish values, and the exemplar of our responsibilities to be a light unto the nations. For many North American Jews, their Jewish lives represent the best of Judaism and are more a light than Jewish life in Israel. This is all the more true in the current American partisan discourse, where Israelis and North American Jews are often aligned on opposite sides of the partisan political divide, and where one sees the other as profoundly morally flawed. Belief in Israel has suffered the same fate as Judaism did in the past. Not only is it not shared, but it is now often itself that which divides us. There is, however, an even more substantive challenge which needs to be overcome. The shared beliefs which united Israel and world Jewry involved a consensus around the significance of Israel alone, and did not evolve into a shared belief in our mutual significance for each other. North American Jews are called to embrace the significance of Israel in their lives, despite the fact that Israeli Jews have never really developed a narrative of the contribution of North American Jewish life in building a viable and significant Jewish life in the modern era. Israel and Zionism want to serve as the uniting force in Jewish life, despite often rejecting the validity and importance of the North American Jewish experience. This sentiment fueled much of Israeli government decisions to not go through with the proposed upgrade in the space at the Kotel for liberal Jews. For Israelis, this type of liberal Jewish worship is still principally viewed as a North American Jewish phenomenon. Israelis see the world as being divided between the places of Jewish destruction and the place of Jewish rebirth. Destruction, whether through Holocaust or assimilation, are the destiny of all diaspora Jewish life, while rebirth is the exclusive gift of Israel. For Israelis, all diaspora Jewry is essentially in the same condition. What changes is the current stage of anti-Semitic manifestation. Proud North American Jews who are at home and who see themselves as modeling the best of what Judaism stands for, notwithstanding the assimilationist pull, which is the consequence of being at home, have great difficulty joining with Israel around a shared belief system which only values Israel and is not reciprocal. North American Jewry challenges Israel to create distinctions within the diaspora and to investigate whether within the Zionist narrative, which sees Israel as the rebirth, there is room also for rebirth in some communities outside Israel. The future of the model of shared belief between Israel and world Jewry depends on whether Israelis and North American Jews can develop such a narrative together. Let's turn now to the model of partnership. Here too, and I know this is beginning to sound like a broken record, we are facing increased challenges. But if we do not put the difficulties on the table, we cannot repair them. the most Zionist of North American Jews, those for whom a relationship with Israel is essential, a given, and a core component of their Jewish life and identity, often view the partnership model as a central framework and guide for their relationship. When confronted with the unraveling of their shared beliefs and with an Israel that they experience as at times paternalistic and disrespectful, they stand tall and declare that to be a partner is a commitment to be responsible both in good times and in bad times, a commitment to share in both the benefits and losses. As partners, they declare a commitment to an Israel as they believe it should be, and do not allow their perception of Israel as it is to undermine in any way their loyalty. In fact, it is precisely in pointing out Israel's shortcomings that they give expression to their deepest love and commitment, and if you will, fiduciary duty as partners. In doing so, they perceive themselves as following the Jewish tradition, which understood criticism as an act of love rather than disloyalty. As partners, their greatest adversary is not Israel or the policies they reject, but rather the North American Jew who allows him or herself to become apathetic and simply walk away. As partners, they seek to model how family, shared belief, and consumerism can unite into a new force. As family, they reject any possibility of exit. As consumers, they demand an Israel which sees them and which will be relevant and inspiring for their Jewish lives. As consumers, they demand that together, Israel and world Jewry will develop and live by a system of shared beliefs which will make this possible. It is, however, as partners that these various models coalesce into a force working to build such an Israel. It is precisely in this manifestation, however, that the partner model alienates Israelis. While for North American Zionists, the partnership model is a vehicle for the relationship for which they yearn, Israelis often experience this manifestation as alternately frightening or paternalistic. Frightening in the sense that Israelis are reticent to allow anyone, no matter how well-meaning, loving, and committed, to have a vote, influence, or shape issues of life and death for Israelis. While security policies and Israel's positions vis-a-vis Gaza, Judea and Samaria, and the occupation have profound moral underpinnings and implications, the consequence of foreign policy moves have a direct impact on the security and well-being of Israelis themselves. There is a broad sentiment that those who live 6,000 to 10,000 miles away do not have the same grasp on reality as those at ground zero. For most Israelis, the idea that someone who does not live here and who is not personally, intimately knowledgeable about the reality of the Middle East, that such a person will have a say, is frightening, disturbing, and even morally problematic. They experience the desire to help Israelis and save them from themselves to be deeply paternalistic and undermining to the democratic process within Israel. When one adds to the equation the current partisan political divide and the fact that many of Israel's Jewish critics seemed to be politically aligned with the left in Israel, whose electoral footprint is shared by only about 10% of Israeli Jews, such partnership intervention is perceived as even more unwelcome. Come live here, Israelis say. Be full partners. Put your children in the army and live amid the complexity of the Middle East, and only then give us advice. The paradox of this reality is that it's precisely those North American Jews who care the most about Israel and Zionism are those from whom Israelis often feel most alienated. However, the partnership model faces an even deeper challenge. It is not merely the fact that Israelis do not welcome a partnership on issues pertaining to security, but the fact that Israelis have never really seen diaspora Jews as partners. Even though the partnership model allows for asymmetry with senior and junior partners, partnership nevertheless assumes some level of parity. For Israelis for whom Israel is rebirth and redemption, diasporic Jews who represent the old Judaism, which is destined to disappear, do not warrant the status of partner. The current relationship is simply too one-sided to allow for a functioning sense of partnership. Resurrecting it will require a reaffirmation on both sides of the significance and contribution of the role of the other, as well as an honest exploration of the rules of our partnership. What are those areas that Israel and its internal democratic process should determine alone? And which areas can be shared by Jewish partners around the world? Are there limits to legitimate criticism? What are the areas where partnership entails telling the other what one thinks and how one feels, as distinct from those areas where partners can tell the other what to do? Such a conversation has yet to emerge, for most Israelis are willing only to accept diaspora Jews as investors in the enterprise of Israel, an enterprise where Israelis are the sole players and diaspora Jews the providers of some of the capital, be it monetary or political. Let's explore the investor dynamic a little more deeply. For many North American Jews, this model of investor is deeply compelling and attractive. In some cases, it is even preferred to that of partnership, precisely because of an awareness of the distance and the fact that North American children's lives are not on the line. In this sense, investor, with its more modest role, feels more appropriate. For others, however, it is attractive precisely because of the power dynamic that it allows, with wealth and influence buying one a significant seat at the Israel table. Now, an interesting development in this investor model is that with the increase in the financial prosperity of Israelis and Israel, the need for North American Jews as investors is diminishing. In fact, as stated in the basic law, Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, Israel now sees itself as an investor in the future of Jewish life in the diaspora, thereby fulfilling yet another aspect of the Zionist dream. There is a constant challenge inherent within the investor relationship, resulting from the deep power asymmetry that it entails. There is often confusion as to who is more significant, the one who invests the capital or the one who uses it to build the enterprise, a fact that hinders the fostering of a real, not to speak of a healthy relationship built exclusively on this model. Recently, the investor model has come up against an even more significant development. The role of North American Jews as investors in the relationship is contingent on their ability to deliver significant capital. As stated, a powerful and successful Israel is in less of a need for the infusion of capital in a financial sense, but it is actually in the realm of capital in its political sense that the investor model is now being reshaped. What are the implications for the investor model when Israel has now identified better investors with greater political capital and who are less critical of Israel's policies? For many Israelis, Christian evangelicals are better investors than the majority of liberal North American Jews. The partner-investor models have evolved into a comedy of errors, where one side views themselves as partner, while the other, at best, sees them as investors, and increasingly not even at that. When coming to the table, it is no longer clear what the ground rules are or who is still invited. Family, shared believers, partners, investors, consumers. Since the rebirth of Israel, each has played a critical role in the relationship between Israel and world Jewry. In many cases, those models were profoundly positive and helped to maintain a relationship despite our geographic and ideological differences. At times, however, they created an appearance of a close relationship, while merely plastering over schisms and disagreements that were festering and becoming ever more significant. We are facing a new era where Israel and world Jewry can no longer assume the inevitability of a future together. If we want such a future, we need to take responsibility for it. First, we need to understand that at times we come to the relationship with different categories and expectations. As in all relationships, health and strength are not achieved through overcoming and eliminating all differences, but principally through recognizing it and understanding them. When we appreciate where the other is coming from, we can reduce the consequences of conflict and at times even facilitate new forms of cooperation. More significantly, it is necessary to recognize that certain categories, while essential in the past, are no longer sufficient or even beneficial in the present. As Jews, we have walked through the valley of the shadow of death together. Today, it is our responsibility together to develop new syntheses between our categories, and possibly new categories to sustain and revitalize our collective identity. We are a family, but we need to build new possibilities of shared beliefs. While we disagree on a policy level, can we build a language of shared values to which all can ascribe? We need to see each other as both consumers and partners in this effort, as we seek out common principles and ideas for a country which aspires to be Jewish and democratic, serve as the homeland for the Jewish people and not merely Israelis, serve as a model and a light for Jewishness to the world, all the while struggling to survive in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the world. In the current environment of partisan divides, this will be difficult, but it is necessary. The challenge of Jewish life in the 21st century is how to survive being in two homes together. Thank you.
Reactions? Marie?
I believe you put it well, especially towards the end, the conclusion that we cannot be complete partners. If we can be partners, it perhaps silent partners, but not complete partners, simply because the Jewish people who are scattered in different nations, they have their first identity as members of the society of the country in which they live. So as we cannot be partners and assume all the benefits and all the liabilities of an Israeli. I believe that shared beliefs is the strongest one, and the religious practices. And Israel itself does not exist in a vacuum. It exists with the support of other nations, America among the first and the strongest supporters of the state of Israel. Therefore, we necessarily have to take positions which will maintain that strong support and doesn't always coincide with the policies and the positions taken by Israel. And so I think we have to agree to disagree, so to speak. But our function really is more of a shared beliefs and silent partners and somewhat investors, but full partners. I cannot see that as being a realistic approach.
So it's interesting that, like, the reason why you feel, your stated reason for feeling like full partnership isn't possible is because it goes back to this question of dual loyalty. It would be too hard to be like an American with full partnership in Israel. It's like we have too many stakes in our own American Jewish community to fully be a full partner in the project of Israel. That's what it sounded like you were saying. I hear your patriotism, and I find it so inspiring. Like from a person who, right, who this is your adopted country, this isn't the place you were born, and who experienced what you experienced, and to come to America and to be so profoundly patriotic and convinced that the American Jewish community is different from any other Jewish community in history. And I don't know whether it's a generational difference or a life experience difference, or I find myself much more tentative about my American, maybe it's just like my American identity was shaped by like a pointless war in Iraq and an endless war in Afghanistan. And like, I think I grew up with a different America. I am unconvinced that America will just not become the next in another series of countries that it will be bad for the Jews in. I just don't know. I don't, like, when I think about my American identity, which I have voted in every election that I've been eligible to vote in. I'm very serious about my responsibilities as a citizen of this country, and incredibly grateful and not to take for granted the privilege that being born in this country has given me in this world. I nonetheless like look at my Jewish identity, and I know in my heart that if I had to choose, if I felt like my ability to be a Jew was threatened in this country, that I would have to leave. And I see what you're saying, like throughout this course, over and over, about the power of American identity. And I just don't know. I just don't know if I have as much certainty as you do about it. For me, the like argument of my kids don't go to the Israeli army, and therefore I can be a certain level of partner, but not a full partner, like, because my life isn't on the line, because I'm not living right there, because I don't vote in Israeli elections and don't participate in Israeli communal life, right? That, like, I don't want to make my Israeli family feel like I'm trying to be paternalistic toward them. To me, that's the barrier to the partnership model, as opposed to a barrier that speaks to American identity and patriotism as a barrier to the partnership model. I don't know. I think I shared more of my personal sort of anxiety about the world than I intended to when I first started speaking.
Very well put, Rabbi. But I may have a different, let's say, view of it, simply because I was born again in America,
Right.
given opportunity, given the means to be an equal citizen, and progressing in the same manner as a native born and not Jewish. And it's because of America that I am here, I'm alive and thriving, et cetera, et cetera. and that influences a great deal my feeling. And also having lived in countries where we had different forms of government, different systems that were not so benign towards the Jewish people, and did made it that make that distinction.
Right, right. When I say that it's possible for me to imagine, it's only possible for me to imagine. Like, you lived through what it was like to live in a country that was unfriendly toward the Jews, and I am not. Like, America, even at the height of American anti-Semitism, has never been like Europe with respect to its Jewish community. And as we've discussed in this course, like, it is a profound statement of American love of Judaism and the Jewish community, the way that the United States as a whole responded to things like Tree of Life Synagogue, right? That the Pittsburgh paper would have the words of Kaddish like plastered on the front of it the day after, and that people really believed that an attack on the Jewish community was an attack on everyone, right? That is not the case anywhere else in the world. It really isn't. And so, right, I completely respect and get that opinion. Does anybody else have any thoughts about, like, do you gravitate toward shared believer as a model like Murray does, or do you feel like investors or partners is a more useful model for thinking about the North American Jewish relationship to Israel?
Steve?
Mishka, you're muted.
Excuse me, I don't really have an answer to that question, because my thinking just flows back and forth from one to the other, and thinking about people that I know. Sometimes it's the day of the week, the answer would be different. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, definitely. I would say, like, if I had to pick one of these as an ideal, the ideal would be the partnership model, but like a real true partnership. Yeah. Where Israel was interested in us and we were interested in Israel, and we were working together to create a shared vision for a Jewish future, where Israel is a grand experiment of Jewish self-rule of the Jewish people as a whole, and where we're all deeply partners in that experiment, right? That for sure is my ideal. And I do worry about the paternalism aspect of it, but that for sure is what I desire from that. Steve.
Yeah, my metaphor circuit breaker started tripping out in the middle of the lecture tonight. But the only one of these that I think has any real coherence to it is partnership. The problem is that in a lot of partnership relations, there are junior partners and senior partners. And it seems to me that the real tension here is about whether the Israelis are going to insist on being the senior partners because they're the ones that are in Israel and we're just out here in Galus, or the Americans are going to insist on being treated as equal partners. And I don't see either side being willing to back down on the question of whether the Israelis are the senior partners and the Americans the junior partners, or if it's an equal partnership.
Right. I think that's a huge issue with the partnership, and like what he said, right? Israelis don't see diaspora Jews as partners. Period. You when I say, like, Israel is a grand experiment of the Jewish people, right? Israelis tend not to think about Israel that way. No. Like, it's an exilic kind of way of thinking about it. They say, no, this is the homeland of the Jewish people. This is our country. It's not an experiment or a project. This is it. This is the main thing. And you're not at the main event. You're attending some kind of side concert.
Oh,
Yeah, Marcia.
I really don't think that many American Jews think that much about Israel either.
Hmm.
It's far removed from us. We don't like, especially the young people, they don't like their views about Arabs and Gaza and the West Bank. And a lot of, especially younger people, are going the opposite of being pro-Israel. And I think we have to somehow work out that.
Yeah. 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 And then is it no wonder that the pro-Israel lobby also has a lot of evangelicals in it, because they are willing to be investors without making any claims toward partnership. And it's easier for Israel to work with those people than to work with your grandchildren, Marcia, who would be fine with being partners if they were really partners, but have no interest in being investors that are completely ignored.
I don't think so. I just remember the difference, I think, with the 6-Day War, when there was such a positive feeling and anxious to help and positive feeling toward Israel that you haven't had in all these years.
Yeah.
Not know how you're going to get it back because of the policies that our kids don't like, and many of us don't like either, but they don't have that much invested in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's like a lot of the young folk, and Rabbi, forgive me, my kids are your age generally. They don't know the history in the same way that we did as growing up, that there was this Holocaust that happened and that Israel came about in large measure because there was worldwide support, at least support for that to happen as a safe haven. When I was in grad school and I was seeing this guy who was from Chile, a Jew from Chile. 7-Day War happened. He was out of the country in 2 days in Israel. That kind of thing I don't think could happen now in any context with some of the folk, the younger folk. I don't think there's that kind of sense of tie or a sense of fear that there is something that could go wrong that would require some kind of immediate action to get out there and fight.
I used to talk about it when I was younger. Like every so often Israel would go to war, the second Lebanon war, I think, was the one that like happened when I was 15 or 16 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of thought to myself, if this keeps going for another couple of years, would I join up? Or if I were 2 years older, would I leave right now and go enlist? And, I went back and forth on that, right? My mother was going to make Aliyah. She spent her grade 10. She was very smart and passed all of her grade 10 classes in 9th grade. And she was set to finish high school a year early. And instead she took grade 10 and went and did grade 10 again, but in Israel, and then came back here and did junior and senior year. And while she was in Israel in grade 10, she signed up. She signed up for the army. She was gonna come back after the 2 years back at home. Her parents were living in Chicago suburbs, and she lived in Israel on her own, did 10th grade in Israel. And between when she was there in 10th grade and when she would have joined up after, Sabra and Shatila happened. It was the first Lebanon war. And it was super uncomfortable for her that it was Sabra and Shatila, this opportunity where Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs were killing each other in Lebanon, and the Israeli army let it happen instead of intervening. They just stood by and watched. And Ariel Sharon was in charge of that section of the war. And my mother rescinded she didn't want to serve in that army. She she rescinded anyway. She decided to go to college in the United States, and her thought was like, I'll do 4-year college, and then after that, I'll make my decision. I'm just going to give myself a little more time. But of course, she met my father, and they got married, and she decided to be a rabbi, and she ended up, you know, life, like every decision shifts your whole life, and after watching that happen to her younger sister just like turned 18 and moved to Israel, made Aliyah, right? So my mother's the oldest of 5, and 2 of her younger sisters made Aliyah at 17 or 18, in part because of watching their older sister like say she was going to do it and then not do it. And so they were like, yeah, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right now. I'm not going to wait around. So that's part of the like lore of my family. But I do wonder, right? It never happened that I was in the right place at the right time to feel like Israel was under an existential threat, and that I had to sign up and put my own body in harm's way to help. I find myself drawn toward the idea of that, the idea of service, the romanticism, not that it's, but like my cousins literally served on the front lines. And I do feel like a lot of respect for that. Yeah. Anyway, I agree. I think there's a real truth to the fact that Israel hasn't really faced an existential threat since 1973 in that same kind of way, and it's also true that the existential threats are not just physical, but also moral and spiritual. More than 50 years of an occupation could also be seen as an existential threat to what Israel's existence is, to what it means to have a democracy. All right, I want us to listen to this conversation. The conversation, I think, in some ways is a mirror of our own conversation. In some ways, pushes in different directions, and I think we'll find it interesting. We'll join back and talk again after.
In the lecture, we explored the models of shared believer, partner, investor, the interplay between them, the way they're changing today, the roles they played in the past as distinct from the roles they play now and possibly in the future. Today, we're going to delve more deeply into each one of these categories. And joining me are Rabbi David Seth Kirshner and Tehila Friedman. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
David, so much of your rabbinate is about ensuring that Jews maintain a relationship with Israel. We know each other for a long time. It's in every part of your being. Which model of these 3 speaks to you the most? I hope it's not investor.
Well, it's investor insofar that we're all invested in Israel. And I think there is a symbiotic relationship there. I think we are equal parts of all 3, actually. We are shared believers, we are shared consumers, and we are shared investors. There's a sense of pride when we feel that sense of investment. I think some of the challenge lies in the fact that, frankly, Danielle, we've become a people that has 2 identities, a diaspora identity and an Israel identity. And
2 people in the diaspora, you mean?
No.
Or the overall people?
The overall Jewish people.
People, yeah.
So 2 people with different core identities, some shared common denominators, some shared DNA in there, but some of it's quite different. And I think that's a hard thing to reconcile. But if you look at it historically, we've always been to people, whether it's Sephardic or Ashkenazic, whether it's that we're from Eastern Europe or Western Europe or North Africa. These kinds of things have always been divides in us that we have celebrated and not used as a differentiator. But for some reason or another, we're really worried like it's an existential threat for these differentiators. I think it's something we should think about embracing more as opposed to making as a
But
conflict.
is there a reason that some of the things that are, some of the differentiators now aren't just there, they seem to be pulling us apart today in different ways. Like, for example, in shared belief, when I just don't believe that Israel is that good anymore. And so it's not something that I'm different. Now, you could be in Israel, by the way, you could be in North America, but I don't believe that some of the causes of Israel are, that Israel represents the best of what the Jewish people are about. So is celebrating enough? How do we overcome some of those moments?
So that's a notion I don't subscribe to.
I see.
So it's hard for me to understand.
Very interesting.
I believe everything that Israel does is for the betterment, even with some mistakes. Now, what I mean,
Tell me more about that, because it's a really important voice.
so I don't mean everything that the Israeli government does is for the betterment. I don't mean everything the Israeli Rabbanut does is for the betterment. I think the notion of Israel and what it stands for is for the greater benefit of the Jewish people as a whole. And not all of that is individually met. That sometimes other people having their needs met is beneficial to us, even if it doesn't scratch our itch. And that's a value for us. I think that's ultimately what a sense of pluralism is about, too.
So for you, your pluralism enables you to embrace Israel as a shared belief, embodying the best of what the Jewish people are.
In an ideal world, absolutely.
And in the real world?
The real world, it's harder to reconcile at times because there are parts of that world where you aspire for a sense of understanding, and people who don't subscribe to it don't give you that understanding. And inherent in the definition of pluralism, you have to embrace them. But if they're not speaking that language, you don't know how to include them. So that's really challenging, right? So if you take people who are pluralistic in their understanding of what it should be to have multiple minyanim and options that are available, whether it's at the Kotel or whether it's at the Tachana Rishona, whether it's at the first station that's become this like eclectic space in Jerusalem, there's a whole gaggle of people that says it's fantastic, and another gaggle of people that says this threatens my existence. So the pluralistic side of me says, I understand both views. Where the rubber hits the road is when the person who says it threatens my existence tries to stop it.
Stop you.
That's hard.
And then it's hard for you to embrace that shared belief.
That's correct.
Tehila, as an Israeli, what's the Israel that you believe in? And do you think that the divide is an Israeli-North American divide, or is it a different divide?
קודם כל, זה משונה לי בכלל לומר ישראל שאני מאמינה בה. כי ישראל היא נס, אבל חוץ מזה היא כלי. זאת אומרת, המדינה היא לא הפרויקט. המדינה היא כלי לפרויקט היהודי. הפרויקט היהודי הגדול הוא או להיות ברכה, כמו שאברהם אבינו מצווה והיה ברכה, או להיות ממלכת כהנים וגוי קדוש. הציונות שלי יושבת על זה שאני מתרגשת מזה שפעם ראשונה אחרי 2000 שנה יש לנו הזדמנות להיות ממלכת כהנים, שיש לנו הזדמנות להיות ממלכה, ושיש לנו ריבונות, ושיש לנו יכולת to practice our Judaism, public sphere, כאילו לקבל החלטות פוליטיות. התורה בשבילי היא טקסט פוליטי, מנסה לבנות חברה, ולא רק אינדיבידואלים. אבל במובן הזה, ישראל, המדינה היא כלי. ולכן מאוד קל לי גם לראות יהודים אחרים, אפילו שהם לא פה כ-shared believers, כי בטח יהודים אמריקאים, הרבה מהם אני רואה אצלם מאוד חזק את העניין של להיות ברכה. כאילו, אז זה יכול להיות ברמת האינדיבידואל, זה יכול להיות ברמת הקהילה, אבל זה תמיד נורא מרשים אותי. זאת אומרת, אנשים שחיים מאוד חזק, גם אני רואה את זה בפילנתרופיה, אבל גם בכאילו מעורבות, כל ה-social justice movement, זה תמיד יהיה יהודים. אני קוראת את ההיסטוריה האמריקאית, פמיניסטיות, שהן לא פמיניסטיות דווקא, לא שהן פמיניזם של בית כנסת, פמיניזם בכלל, והן יהודיות, וזה לא סתם, משהו ברסטלס הזה, והדבר הזה...
את מאוד מכבדת. כשאת מדברת על יהדות צפון אמריקה, אני מרגיש שאת מכבדת אותם.
זה יותר ממכבדת. אני מרגישה ש... קודם כל, יש בי צד שהוא פשוט יהיה עם הכרת תודה. אני פמיניסטית. עכשיו, אני פמיניסטית דתית. לפני שהייתי פמיניסטית, הייתי פמיניסטית דתייה. זאת אומרת, המקום הראשון בעולם שבו עלה בדעתי שיש בעיה היה בית כנסת. ואני יודעת שבסוף אנחנו הבאנו את זה. זאת אומרת, הרבה מהפמיניזם הדתי נניח התפתח בארצות הברית. אז יש בי הכרת טובה על הדבר הזה, לא רק, בכלל, כל הניסיון הזה למצוא את הדרך לחיים יהודיים, יהדות וערכים ליברליים. איך עושים, הומניזם, וערכים הומניסטיים, איך עושים את הדבר הזה, שזה אתגר ישראלי ענק, אני מרגישה שיש...
So you've moved me to it's interesting, when you speak about shared belief, then, and I was speaking Hebrew before, that's,
כן.
we're in our two homes. I'm just forgetting which home I'm in. It's interesting, you moved shared belief to another place, which is, I want to delve deeper into it, because in the lecture I spoke about how it's, and you were uncomfortable with it, that it's a shared belief about Israel as the unifier of Jewish people, and you felt that that was putting Israel in a place that Israel's a means, not an end, when in many ways Israel served as a means to unify Jewish life. You're trying to move us to a higher, in a certain sense, more Jewish dimension of shared belief. Tell me a little bit more about what would be the shared beliefs that you would want to have with world Jewry?
כשאני חוזרת להתחלה של התנועה הציונית, אז אני רואה שהם לגמרי היו שם. זאת אומרת, זה היה ברור שחוץ ממקלט בטוח לעם היהודי, יש פה גם איזה רצון לייצר מדינה שהיא אור לגויים, שהיא חברת מופת, זה חלק נורא חזק בשפה הציונית מההתחלה. ישראל היא פרויקט. היא פרויקט, היא עדיין כאילו בשלבים לא כל כך, לא ממש בהתחלה, אבל די פרויקט צעיר.
We're not there yet.
No, we're not there yet, and I'm not sure we'll ever be there.
But I think what Tehila is saying, I agree with. I actually had, underlined in the walls of this building, which is Judaism is not supposed to be in a petri dish, and neither is Zionism. And it is an ongoing, refined act. And this idea of we have a state, we have a government, we have a people, therefore it must be perfect, is naive. It's utopian, which inherently is partly naive, right? I subscribe to that fully, that, just like in any relationship we're in, whether it's with our spouses, with our children, with our bosses, there are perfections and imperfections, and appreciating and accepting what that's like, even with our relationship with God, from being a religious view. It's about accepting those imperfections and saying this is the whole picture, and it doesn't live in a petri dish. If we only study the Talmud and we never take its application to the real world, we've done no service to the value of the Talmud. And I appreciate very much what you said on that front.
Do you want to go back to the shared beliefs a little bit? Now, how do you respond to David? Here it is, someone from outside of Israel looking at Israel.
האמת היא שיש לי ממש, אני מתרגשת כשאתה אומר את זה, כי הרבה פעמים אני מרגישה על יהודים אמריקאים שהם מסתכלים עלינו, על ישראל במין אכזבה, וגם כאילו בא לי לומר להם, למה, ארצות הברית יותר טובה היום? זאת אומרת...
But that's not a defense, but you want to say it. I know.
לא, כאילו, אני מבינה, אבל כאילו זה לומר, מה זאת אומרת? כן, למדינה ולחברה יש ups ו-downs ויש תקופות, we're struggling, כאילו, ומשהו במבט הזה שהוא אומר, אוקיי, זה לא מושלם, דווקא אני, בתור מי שיש לי...
You're much more critical of Israel.
כן,
I'm looking...
by far.
Because I know your whole career is about fighting to build the Israel that you will feel Jewishly in the broadest sense of what you define as Jewish, in the moral, and
totally.
that this is the Israel you want, and you're going to fight it, and here so how does it feel to you?
לא, אז אני אומרת, אז לכן, באמת, זה ברור, שאני הרבה יותר, ודווקא בגלל זה, יש בזה משהו כל כך מרגש, בלומר, אני מבין שיש פייט, ואני גם מוכן להיות פרטנר בפייט הזה.
See, that moves us to the partner model. And I want to ask both of you about that.
I want to say one thing. Bereshit Rabbah teaches us, love without admonishment is not love. And I think what makes it work for Tehillah is that no one, not you, not me, no one can question her love for this country when she offers admonishment. But today...
You would be surprised.
Well,
They shouldn't.
they shouldn't. Okay, fair enough. But today, for some reason or another, there's a problem that some people are offering admonishment in either in their tone, their direction, or their platform. We are becoming leery of their motives, and if indeed that is coming from a place of love.
When you criticize Israel, until you get there, there's so many other things. I love Israel, and I didn't, when you were talking before, and I didn't know if you were talking about Israel as it is, to even accept that there's a difference between theory and reality. I wasn't even sure. You're not on a, criticizing Israel is not a comfort zone for you. It's this is, we're not talking about the family model, but it's your family. And that's where you start. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to criticize, but you're just, from the beginning, like, in Jerry Maguire, you had me at hello. Yes. Like, Israel has you at hello. But let's delve into the place of criticism. Now, I accept, and you're right, part of the challenge is that criticism today is seen as an act of disengagement rather than the way our tradition sees it as a sign of love. How should criticism take place? You spoke about the language, you spoke about the forums, how should criticism take place is the first part. And the second part I want to ask you about is, how do you criticize? How do you criticize? Where are the limits too constrictive? And where do they have to be extended in your mind?
So I'll start with a teaching from David Wolpe, who pulls in one of his favorite theologians, The Simpsons. And Marge is hosting Thanksgiving, and her mother and sisters walk in the door, and she opens the door for Thanksgiving, and she said, "Marge, I just want you to know you've done nothing right." And Wolpe uses that in a brilliant way of saying, like, that's our relationship with Israel, because only Marge's mother can pull that off. If you come into my synagogue and you hear me criticize Israel, anyone who's been to my synagogue for more than 10 minutes knows that it's being offered in a place of love. Now, if you've not been there for more than 10 minutes and you're just getting a snapshot of one moment, you can misinterpret that. And in the binary world in which we are morphing into, that's a dangerous place. So
it's not that so in your synagogue, you criticize Israel.
I'll criticize Israel when I think it deserves to be criticized, just like I will criticize my wife and my children when I think they need to be criticized.
But you won't criticize them in shul.
You better not.
I better not. And my love for them is unconditional. They're people who I'd lay down in traffic for, and I would do the exact same thing for the state of Israel. But offering that criticism doesn't mean that I am playing with the tether of our relationship. And for some people, to offer that criticism feels like you're taking a knife to the rope that connects us, and it shouldn't.
Is it the motivation or is it the consequence of the criticism that
It's not only
frightens
the
you?
motivation and the tone. It's also you speak in we. I can hear criticism when people speak in we.
Yes.
I can't take it when it's you versus us. That's it's all. It's just something different.
Let's expand on that a little bit, and I think that's really important. This North American Jews as partners are North American Jews who say, Israel's the homeland of the Jewish people. I'm here. I'm in it. I'm count me in. I'm here. I'm going to be here, but I'm not going to be here just to wave a flag. Partners don't wave flags. I'm here to roll up my sleeves. I know it's not the same, but I'm here to. I want the Israel that I could respect. I want an Israel that my children could have a relationship with. What do you feel are there limits to criticism? And how do you feel about criticism made by partners who don't live in Israel? As an Israeli, how do you feel about it? And are there limits to where you're saying, just excuse me, just stay away?
זה ברור שהרבה הרבה הרבה יותר קל לי ומתבקש ולגיטימי זה אפילו לא ביקורת, זה כאילו דיון בכל מה שקשור ליהדות. עכשיו, איפה עובר הגבול בין דברים שקשורים ליהדות לבין דברים שקשורים לסקיוריטי או דברים כאלה, זה קשה, אני מבינה שזה לא, אפשר להתווכח
יהדות,
על
למה
זה.
את מתכוונת? דת ומדינה,
כן.
מעמד האישה?
כשאתה אומר משהו על הכותל, זה obvious, כאילו...
זה שייך לו בדיוק כמו שזה.
בדיוק, הכותל הוא שלך, כמו שהכותל הוא שלי. אני מרגישה שאני, אפילו יותר מזה. ברגע שאני אומרת, הכותל לא שלך, אני חותרת תחת הזכות שלי לכותל, בגלל שבסוף מדינת ישראל היא מדינת העם היהודי. זו הסיבה שקיבלנו אותה כאילו, קיבלנו את הזכות לדבר הזה. מבחינה ציונית, אם אני מרחיקה את העם היהודי וזה מפסיק להיות מדינת העם היהודי, למה יש לנו זכות למדינה? אין עם ישראלי. אז במובן הזה, כאילו כשמדובר על ירושלים, על הכותל, על גיור, יש כל מיני נושאים שהאימפקט הוא מאוד מאוד ישיר, וזה ברור. כאילו זה כמו, איך אתה אומר את זה? No taxation without representation, it's not taxation, אבל זה כאילו, דברים שהאימפקט הוא מאוד ישיר.
So for you, on all issues of state, religion, etc., which impact on world Jewry, Israel belongs to them, the Judaism of Israel belongs to them just as much as it belongs to you.
נכון,
אבל. What's the אבל? The big אבל.
עכשיו, דברים שהם קשורים לסקיוריטי, לשאלות של מלחמה ושלום, דברים כאלה שהאימפקט הוא כל כך דרמטי על החיים שלנו, על הילדים שלנו שבצבא, כל הקיץ' הזה, אבל הוא אמיתי, זה החיים שלנו. שם זה יותר קשה.
יותר קשה או אסור?
שם אני חושבת שזה counterproductive, זאת אומרת, היכולת שלנו לשמוע היא הרבה יותר נמוכה. עכשיו, יש דברים שהם in between. כאילו נגיד כל הסיפור של refugees, כאילו כל הסיפור הזה של immigrants. עכשיו, זה יהודי, זה יהדות או זה יותר מסובך הדבר הזה.
רציתי להגיד שקודם כל זה מסובך. What isn't complicated that's meaningful in our lives, right?
Yeah.
Like, relationships are complicated, so many jobs are complicated, life is complicated, but the things that matter the most, my relationship with God is complicated, the things that matter the most to me, that are complicated, I embrace, I don't run away from. And that's the beauty in it.
See, but that's what a partner, a family and partner says, complicated is not my problem.
It's like encumbered.
It's like encumbered.
Right.
One of the challenge, though, here I want to push both of you out of your comfort zone a little bit, because this is a love fest. It really is.
Yeah.
And I feel really good at it. And I respect it because I know I can't take it for granted. And I don't want, though, to vilify a whole bunch of people who aren't in this love fest, for whom pain about occupation, pain about things that Israel is doing, are just too great. And they don't know how to stay inside. They don't know how to feel that love. And you say to them, do it out of love, and I'm with you. But they're not with you. They don't feel, they're saying, there is no yes, but. It's about the occupation. You know, what am I supposed to do? Israel is not what I want it to be. The gap between it, and they have a list. You know, they check the list. It goes from democracy and religious freedom and refugees and Palestinians and morale and God. It just goes down. At what point? Now, for you, it's not there. You'll never get to that point, as you said. But how do you deal with those Jews? If they're your congregants, they're your congregants' children. You look at the American Jewish community, Canadian Jew at large. You're not just in Temple Emmanuel. You have a bigger space. How do you deal with that? Because you can't, to silence it, we have to put it on the table here.
אבל אני רוצה לשאול, כי אתם מכירים את האנשים האלה ואני פחות. אבל זה אותו דבר כמו שהם מרגישים כלפי המדינה שלהם. למה זה אחרת? כאילו, כשהם מסתכלים על...
It's a fair enough question.
It's a very good question. I think one of the categorical differences is that for whatever reason or another, when it comes to our Jewish identity, of which Israel plays a significant role, the idea of erasing a part of our DNA feels sacrilegious. Whereas in America, we feel that we have come, we have arrived, we have planted, we have flourished like nowhere else before, but we're still nomadic. insofar that if, God forbid, what has happened in Spain or in Eastern Europe were to happen in America, we could take the same values and move them to Argentina or move them to
That is
Madagascar.
an unbelievable statement. That's just an unbelievable statement. I want to offer an opposite answer, but I want.
Did you also stop hearing it?
Only briefly. It paused,
Yeah.
it glitched for a second, but that was all. Although it's glitched right now, unless you stopped it.
I stopped it because the sound went off.
Just briefly.
Okay, the sound is back for you.
Yeah, try it again.
All right.
But I'm very happy that
Can you
that
hear it?
statement was on the record because it's an unbelievable statement. I thought it was actually the opposite,
Which is?
and that is that since I'm American or Canadian, I have nowhere else to go. My criticism always stays inside. And so, since it is my home, Israel's 6,000 to 10,000 miles away. And you need greater energy. But it so reflects your commitment, who you are and family. And I'm not arguing with you. I'm saying there's two sides of the story. One side is, and it's remarkable, this is that Israel is sacrilegious when it violates these principles in a way that America or Canada are not, because I don't have my whole Jewish identity invested in it. I love it. I never thought, thank you. You gave to the I Engage series a gift. But the other side is that at what point, from 6, it's just, I need so much effort. Here it is, America's America. So you know what, I don't like this president, or I'm in Canada and I don't like this prime minister. It'll pass. But this is my home, there's nothing I could do. But why have a relationship with Israel if it crosses over so many things? And so here you increasingly see, you were hearing that. How do we allow them? See, they don't know how to be partners. They've given up. How do we, what place do they have in that conversation?
So that's the problem. So let's dial out, right? Let's come up to 30,000 feet for a minute. At 30,000 feet, I think we have to admit that Jews as a whole, diaspora in Israel, we are kvetchy, wangni lot.
Spoken as a rabbi.
Spoken as a rabbi.
We won't show this, by the way,
Pope,
in your...
They show it, they know. The Pope goes to Yad Vashem, and he didn't lay enough wreaths. Right? Like, this is the number. He didn't
The wreath wasn't big enough.
He didn't acknowledge of what this happened. The Pope goes to Yad Vashem. Let's think about the history of the papacy and the Vatican. And he goes to Yad Vashem, and one of his first acts was Pope Benedict, and all we saw were condemnations throughout the entire Jewish media world. So as a whole, you gotta say, like, okay, we are predisposed and wired to be a kvetchy lot. If you dial out of some of that kvetchiness, and we can start to say, okay, let's engage. Let's care about it. I actually think that Americans today are becoming more engaged in the civic process than ever before. And I think the divide that has happened for someone like me, who is a rooted, passionate Zionist, but a proud American, who has in conflict now my love for the state of Israel with my Jewish values as an American, that this has led people like me, which I think there are plenty of in America, to be engaged in the America they dream about. I think this has happened time and time again, in the 1800s for sure, but definitely during the 60s.
You have to fight for the America you want right now.
The America you dream about. And when it's not what we want, we don't give up. We roll up our sleeves. And what I've seen from people who are philanthropists, what I've seen from young dreamers, what I've seen from older people is they're rolling up their sleeves and being engaged in the process. And I think it's very similar.
אני מסכימה שזה דומה. זאת אומרת, שני דברים אני מסכימה. אחד, עם למה ישראל כואבת לך יותר, אני מבינה את זה. אני הגעתי מזמן למסקנה שאני יכולה לשאת אנשים שאין להם אלוהים, אבל אנשים שהאלוהים שלהם הוא רע, אני לא יכולה לשאת את זה. זאת אומרת, אנשים שבשם אלוהים עושים דברים רעים,
It's an important distinction.
זה גדול עליי. אז אני מבינה את המקום שאומר, אוקיי, מדינות, אבל זה יהודי, אני מבינה את זה. זה הרי בא מהמקום הכי עמוק היהודי שלנו, שאני לגמרי שם. אני גם חושבת, אבל, שבאמת קורים תהליכים דומים בשני המדינות, ולכן אני לא בטוחה שהחלוקה הזו של החברה הישראלית, the diaspora Jewry, it doesn't work like that.
No.
בגלל קודם כל, החברה הישראלית מורכבת הרי מחלקים שונים, וגם היהדות האמריקאית יש בתוכה חלקים שונים. ובתוך כל אחת מהחברות יש כזה cultural war inside, בין, קוראים לזה קונסרבטיבים לעומת ליברלים, אני לא יודעת אם זה מה אני לא בטוחה שזו הגדרה שאני קונה אותה, אני לא יודעת, אבל סביב ערכים של שוויון, סביב ערכים הומניסטיים, סביב הבלנס בין הקולקטיב לבין האינדיבידואל, יש בשתי החברות, זה תהליך בינלאומי, הסיפור הזה של אנטי-גלובליזציה ועלייה של לאומיות וכל מיני דברים כאלה, והם קורים בשני המקומות. אז אני מרגישה שלכן זה כל כך מוזר לי, כשאני שומעת אנשים אומרים, ישראלי ככה וככה, ולכן אני לא במשחק, אני לא משחק יותר, ואני אומרת, אבל בבית זה אותו דבר.
Listen, there was a law in Arizona a few years ago that allowed the police, without any background, to stop and frisk anyone that they thought was an illegal alien or doing something wrong, without probable cause. This was against the Constitution. This upset many liberal Americans. I didn't hear one liberal America say that they should boycott, divest, or sanction the state of Arizona. I didn't hear one liberal American say, I'm never going to Arizona, I'm never flying over Arizona. I didn't hear one liberal American say, I'm not supporting any of their sports teams. I didn't hear any of that sort, meaning the brokenness in America is something that we accept as democracy is a continuing experiment. The brokenness in Israel we take as a shattered piece of glass that can never be put together, and that's the wrong paradigm. It's the wrong
David
paradigm.
and Tehila, it's a great place to end. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's my honor. It's an honor
Thank
to
you.
talk with you.
It's
Thank you.
Member Lowe.
All right, so thoughts, reactions, reflections.
He is completely wrong about the lack of any threat to boycott Arizona. There was an enormous amount of threatening to cancel conventions and business trips and all kinds of things and not visit the sports teams. And also North Carolina, with its various bathroom laws, has gotten a lot of boycotting type sanctions against it. So
Yeah,
I don't
I
think
mean,
that undermined his position terribly, but he was just flat wrong about that.
I think he's flat wrong about a bunch of stuff. It is true, right? Even just last week, the state of Florida, like Disney and the Florida and like the whole thing, and Disney's thinking about going somewhere. Like constantly, it happens that people are thinking about like the politics of the state and whether you want to be associated with that state. For sure, for sure.
Yes.
Other reactions aside from that, like unfortunate ending.
It was the most interesting of any of these conversations.
Really?
I like, yes.
What was so compelling about it for you?
It was animated to the point where people were talking from their heart and not just being more intellectual about it. And I think Hartman himself was more so, and he certainly wasn't interrupting as many times as he had in the past. But his questions were good and the answers were totally sincere and heartfelt. And again, coming from the heart, not from so much of an intellectual point.
Mm-hmm. So their model of partnership, something that we can get behind. I feel like David Seth Kushner and Tehila, they actually came to a kind of an agreement about where there were places for partnership, right? And Tehila, who's one of the most outspoken critics of certain policies of this government of the state of Israel within the state, also was very clear that she finds it hard to listen to that from American Jews when it comes to specifically about things that have to do with security. Well, when it comes to things that have to do with Judaism, she's okay with it. I really appreciated when she said, it's the Am HaYehudi, the Jewish nation, not the Am HaYisraeli, the Israeli nation. But I also think she's wrong about that, right? Like David Seth Kirshner was wrong about the internal United States boycotts or whatever. But I think she was wrong about the Israeli, this question of, is there an Israeli identity that's unique from the Jewish identity? And we listened in this course to a Palestinian who was completely comfortable with an idea of an Israeli identity that's separate from a Jewish identity. And I do think that you have to confront some of that, not just the 20% of Israelis who are not Jewish, but also some of the Jewish Israelis who like think of their Judaism as separate from their Israeliness. And her commitment to these categories as being completely synonymous, right? There is no Am HaYisraeli, there's an Am HaYehudi. That's very powerful. But I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily agree with her about that, who are Israeli. I liked when she talked about the like Judaism, like that the project, that Israel isn't the end goal of this Jewish project, but that Israel is a means to a broader end, which is, v'yeh bracha, to be a blessing, and that Judaism comes into this world with a mission, and Israel is hopefully, in its ideal version, one way to get to that end goal, one vehicle to achieve that mission. But world Jewry, American Jewry, also hopefully is a vehicle to achieve that mission. And I found that also to be powerful and meaningful.
I think one of the things that it's a chuckle to say that we're a kvetchy people, but we say that all the time in one form or another. But hearing the fact that one can argue is completely acceptable, and that one should argue is acceptable with respect for one another. And that, unfortunately, is not something that you hear all the time coming out of Israel. It's certainly not what you hear here. That was a part that it felt good to hear.
Yeah. I've never heard David Seth Kirshner say anything critical about Israel, by the way. And neither had Daniel Hartman. Daniel Hartman was like, "You never say anything critical about Israel." And David Seth Kirshner was like,
very often though.
"What?"
I'll bet you don't get to attend his sermons very often though.
No.
If that's where he does it, we probably wouldn't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, right. I did go to Israel with him on a trip. So I spent 10 days with him on an Aipac trip, and also I applied to work at his synagogue. That was one of the places that I applied to in addition to Haggadah Achim.
Well, gotcha. That's good.
I was struck by some of the discussion of the Kotel because the Kotel is under Israeli political sovereignty, and because Israelis vote for that government and American Jews don't, the notion that the Israeli government is ever going to represent the opinions of American Jews on the Kotel in any way seems naive, because we have zero electoral power. The Palestinians have a better shot than we do, because at least they get votes. And that's another one of these issues that ties into this partnership model. You can't really have a partnership model when one of the partners is disenfranchised from the political realities of the state that is supposed to be the key project of this partnership. And that's probably one of my biggest concerns is I don't want to share in Israeli political sovereignty. I don't. I've got my share here. But the way in which I can be even a junior partner without some sort of political representation is not clear. And I think that's probably one of the bigger threats to the concept of the partnership model. Is there's got to be some common basis on which the partnership can be formed, and the Israeli political system doesn't allow that.
I will say this though, Steve, Zionism and the institutions of Zionism still exist separate from the state, which is kind of weird, but it is how our system functions. And the World Zionist Congress, which elects its representatives every 5 years and which allocates a huge amount of world Jewry's money with respect to how it's invested in the state of Israel, is like any Jewish person in the whole world can vote in those elections, and those elections have real life consequences for how that money is distributed. And that money does affect things like the Kotel, not because but you're right that the Kotel is ultimately under Israeli sovereignty, but like the money that the Joint Distribution Committee and the World Zionist Congress can put to bear on things like funding pluralism in Israel, like, has a huge consequences for like whether Israeli elected officials respond to those kinds of pressures. So we do have like a systemic tool on, in how we can do it. But the percentage of American Jews who vote in the World Zionist Congress is like a fraction of 1%. So we are not availing ourselves of this lever, of this democratic lever that we could be availing ourselves of. And who does vote is like every yeshiva sends busloads and busloads of people because, and they vote exactly the way their Rebbe tells them to vote. So that's part of this story also.
Yeah.
So how do you vote?
Okay. Next week is our final course, our final class in this course, and the concluding lecture is called At Homeness, and it brings us full circle in our story, and we'll meet next Thursday to do some discussion of that. We'll watch the lecture together and discuss it, and we'll discuss the course as a whole and what we've gotten from it and what questions we continue to have. And I'll say some stuff about my feelings about the whole course also next week. So I want to thank everybody for being here this week and participating.
Yes.
And we'll see you. Oh, before we leave, let's count Omer. It wasn't late enough to count Omer when we daven Mincha at 7:15, but it is now, for sure. So you can find it in the Sidur on page 236. Hineni muchan umzuman lekayem mitzvat aseh shel spirata Omer. כמו שכתוב בתורה, וספרתם לכם ממחרת השבת מיום הביאכם את עומר התנופה, 7 שבתות תמימות תהיינה עד ממחרת השבת השביעית, תספרו 50 יום, והקרבתם מנחה חדשה לאדוני. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו על ספירת העומר. And we turn to page 239, top 1. Hayom esrim yom shehem shnei shavuot v'shisha yamim la'omer. Today is 20 days, which is 2 weeks and 6 days in the counting of the Omer. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Shabbat shalom.